She curled up in row 10, her faded military jacket pulled tight against the airplane's chill, looking more like someone who'd missed her connecting flight than a first-class passenger. The whispers started before takeoff, cruel judgments about her threadbare clothes and worn boots echoing through the cabin. But when Captain Martinez collapsed over the Rocky Mountains and a Category 5 storm tore apart their navigation systems, when the terrified co-pilot's voice cracked over the intercom, asking if there were any combat pilots aboard, Jessica Stone opened her eyes and stood up. The woman they dismissed as nobody was about to become their only hope for survival. Quick pause before we continue. Tell us, where in the world are you watching from? If you're enjoying these stories, make sure to hit subscribe because tomorrow's episode is absolutely mind-blowing. Flight 623 pulled back from Gate A14 at Phoenix Sky Harbor Airport precisely at 10:47 p.m. Its Boeing 777 engine spinning to life with a low rumble that vibrated through the cabin walls. Outside the terminal window, desert wind had begun swirling dust across the tarmac, creating small tornadoes that danced between the aircraft and ground equipment. Winter storms in Arizona were rare, but tonight's weather report suggested severe turbulence ahead once they climbed above the Devitt floor. Jessica Stone pressed her face against the small window in seat 10C, watching the ground crew disconnect the final power cables and remove the wheel chocks. Her reflection stared back from the glass, a woman in her early 30s with tired eyes and shoulder-length dark hair that needed cutting. She wore a faded military surplus jacket over a plain black sweater, both items showing the kind of wear that came from years of use rather than fashion choices. Her jeans had a small tear near the right knee, carefully mended with thread that didn't quite match the original denim. To the other passengers settling into their seats around her, Jessica appeared unremarkable, just another traveler heading home after the holidays, probably someone who'd saved up for months to afford the upgrade to premium economy. Her small black duffel bag was tucked under the seat in front of her, containing the minimal possessions of someone who'd learned to travel light: a change of clothes, basic toiletries, a paperback novel with dog-eared pages, and buried beneath everything else, a folded photograph she'd looked at so many times the edges had worn smooth. The businessman in 10A adjusted his Italian leather briefcase and glanced sideways at Jessica's scuffed hiking boots. Richard Thornton had paid $2,800 for his first-class ticket, and he expected a certain caliber of fellow travelers. His charcoal suit was tailored. His gold watch was Swiss, and his carry-on luggage bore the discreet logos of expensive brands. When he'd seen Jessica boarding with her worn jacket and that patched duffel bag, he'd assumed she was in the wrong section. "Excuse me," Richard said to flight attendant Maria Santos as she passed down the aisle, checking seatbelts. "I think there might be some confusion about seating assignments. That woman doesn't appear to have a first-class boarding pass." Maria glanced to Jessica, then checked her passenger manifest. "Miss Stone is confirmed in 10C, sir. Is there a problem with your seat?" Richard waved dismissively. No problem, just seemed unusual." But his tone suggested it was very much a problem, at least in his mind. 3 rows ahead, Dr. Elena Rodriguez finished organizing her medical journals in the overhead compartment. She'd been attending a trauma surgery conference in Phoenix and was eager to return to her practice in Denver. Elena had noticed Jessica during boarding, had seen the way other passengers' eyes lingered on the worn clothing and modest luggage. As a surgeon who'd worked in military hospitals early in her career, Elena recognized something familiar in Jessica's posture, the way she moved through the aisle with economic precision, the way her eyes automatically scanned exits and safety equipment. The particular stillness she maintained while other passengers fidgeted with the electronics and magazines. "That woman has military bearing," Elena murmured to herself, settling into seat 7B. But she kept the observation private, focusing instead on the surgical case notes she planned to review during the flight. Near the front of the cabin, 9-year-old Emma Rodriguez clutched a stuffed elephant as flight attendant Carlos Medina helped her fasten her seatbelt. Emma was traveling alone to visit her father in Denver, her first unaccompanied minor flight. She'd been nervous during boarding, but Carlos's gentle manner had helped calm her fears. "Remember, if you need anything during the flight, just press this button," Carlos explained, showing Emma the call light. I'll be checking on you every few minutes, okay? Emma nodded, her dark eyes wide with the mixture of excitement and anxiety that comes with new experiences. She glanced back towards the premium economy section where Jessica sat quietly by the window. Something about the woman's calm presence was reassuring, though Emma couldn't articulate why. Behind them, in row 15, Samantha Collins adjusted her sleeping infant son against her shoulder while struggling with an overflowing diaper bag. Samantha was a single mother returning from a job interview in Phoenix, hoping against hope that the position she'd applied for would offer the stability her family desperately needed. The flight represented more than transportation. It was a bridge between her current struggles and the possibility of a better future. "Ma'am, would you like me to help you get settled?" Maria asked, noticing Samantha's difficulty managing both the baby and her belongings. "Thank you. That's very kind," Samantha replied, grateful for the assistance. As Maria helped organize her seat area, Samantha noticed how she moved with the confident efficiency of someone accustomed to handling emergencies. What she didn't know was that Maria's calm demeanor came from 6 years as a Navy corpsman before joining the airline industry. Captain Luis Martinez completed his pre-flight checklist in the cockpit, his experienced hands moving automatically through procedures he'd performed thousands of times during his 18-year commercial flying career. At 46, Martinez was considered one of the airline's most reliable pilots, with an impeccable safety record and the kind of steady temperament that inspired confidence in both crew members and passengers. "Weather looks challenging once we get above the desert winds," Martinez said to First Officer Ashley Chen as she programmed their flight plan into the navigation computer. "Phoenix approach is reporting moderate turbulence, but Denver is showing clear skies with light winds." Ashley nodded, though something in the updated weather reports concerned her. At 28, she was still relatively new to commercial aviation, having joined the airline 16 months earlier after completing her flight training. She'd been paired with Captain Martinez for the past 4 months and had come to appreciate his mentoring style and wealth of experience. "Captain, I'm seeing some reports of rapidly developing weather systems over the Colorado Plateau," Ashley mentioned, pointing to her weather display. "The storm cells weren't there during our briefing, but they're showing significant development in the past hour." Martinez leaned over to study her screen. "Desert weather can be unpredictable this time of year. We'll keep an eye on it, but our route should keep us well north of any significant activity." What neither pilot knew was that a collision between Pacific air masses and unusually cold Canadian air was creating atmospheric conditions that would generate one of the most severe winter storms in Colorado's recorded history. The Weather Service's computer models hadn't predicted the rapid intensification, and by the time meteorologists recognized the danger, multiple aircraft would already be airborne and flying directly into the developing system. Jessica Stone settled deeper into her seat as the aircraft pushed back from the gate, her eyes automatically tracking the ground crew movements outside her window. Even in civilian clothes, even after 4 years away from military aviation, her pilot's instincts remained sharp. She noticed the slight hesitation in the tug driver's movements, the way the wing walker positioned himself differently than standard procedure dictated, the minor delay in ground power disconnect that suggested the crew was being extra cautious due to weather conditions. Her right hand rested on the armrest, fingers occasionally tapping in the subtle pattern that had become a nervous habit since her discharge from the Air Force. The physical therapy had helped with most of her injuries, but the psychological effects from her final combat mission remained challenging to manage. The Air Force Medical Board had been clear. Pilots with post-traumatic stress, even managed cases, represented unacceptable risks during critical flight operations. Jessica closed her eyes as the aircraft began its taxi toward the active runway. But sleep didn't come immediately. Instead, memories surfaced unbidden. The weight of an F-16's control stick in her hands, the roar of afterburners during combat takeoffs, the precise coordination required to deliver ordnance on target while enemy surface-to-air missiles tracked her aircraft through hostile airspace. She'd been good at it, better than good. Her call sign Viper had been earned through an uncanny ability to strike precisely and retreat before enemy forces could respond, to bring damaged aircraft home when lesser aviators would have ejected. But that was before the improvised explosive device had detonated 50 feet from her aircraft during a close air support mission in Syria. before the blast wave had caused her to lose consciousness temporarily, before the investigation board had declared her unfit for flight status despite her protests that she could fly as well as anyone in the squadron. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Martinez speaking. We've been cleared for takeoff on runway 26 right. Our flight time to Denver tonight will be approximately 2 hours and 30 minutes. We'll be cruising at 39,000 feet, and the weather looks good once we get above these desert winds. Flight attendants, please prepare for departure.
Jessica opened her eyes as the engines spooled up to take off power, their vibration traveling through the aircraft structure into her bones. She'd always loved this moment, the transition from earthbound machine to flying aircraft, the precise application of physics and engineering that lifted tons of metal and human cargo into the sky. Even as a passenger, she found herself automatically monitoring engine sounds, feeling for any irregularities in the acceleration pattern, noting the pilot's technique as the aircraft rotated and climbed away from Phoenix's lights. Richard Thornton fastened his seatbelt and continued his quiet assessment of his fellow passengers. The woman in 10C seemed oddly calm for someone who appeared to be flying premium economy for the first time. Most nervous travelers fidgeted with magazines or checked their phones repeatedly during takeoff. But Jessica sat perfectly still, her breathing regular, her hands relaxed on the armrests, despite the obvious nervous tapping of her right fingers. Probably anxiety medication, Richard concluded silently. Some kind of psychological disorder that requires pharmaceutical management. The judgment felt comfortable, fitting neatly into his assumptions about people who couldn't afford proper traveling attire. Dr. Elena Rodriguez noticed the woman's stillness too, but her medical training led to different conclusions. The finger-tapping pattern in Jessica's right hand was consistent with stress management techniques rather than anxiety or medication side effects. The woman's posture and alertness during takeoff suggested someone comfortable with aviation rather than nervous about flying. Elena had seen similar presentations in combat veterans during her residency at Walter Reed Medical Center. As Flight 623 climbed through 10,000 feet and the lights of Phoenix fell away below them, Jessica finally allowed herself to relax. The constant hum of the engines and the gentle motion of the aircraft triggered the deep fatigue she'd been fighting all day. She'd driven 8 hours from her small apartment in Tucson to catch this flight, her ancient Toyota pickup burning oil and threatening to overheat during the mountain passes. The drive had been necessary to scatter her brother's ashes in the Colorado mountains, as he'd requested before his death from cancer 4 months earlier. Jessica's brother had been a Marine pilot during the Iraq War, and the mountains represented both his service and his final peace. She'd taken emergency leave from her job at a small municipal airport, spending most of her savings on the flight and a hotel room in Denver. Jessica pulled her jacket tighter and closed her eyes, letting the aircraft's motion lull her toward sleep. Around her, the cabin settled into the quiet rhythm of a late-night flight. Passengers dozed or read quietly. Flight attendants dimmed the lights further, and Captain Martinez engaged the autopilot as they reached their cruising altitude above the Arizona desert. None of them knew that 150 miles ahead, atmospheric conditions were generating the kind of severe weather system that occurred perhaps once in a decade. Wind shears capable of flipping aircraft, ice accumulation that could bring down engines, and turbulence severe enough to cause structural damage to even large commercial jets. Jessica's breathing deepened as exhaustion finally overcame her hypervigilance. Her right hand relaxed on the armrest, the nervous tapping subsiding as muscle tension faded. For the first time in weeks, she looked peaceful, almost vulnerable in her worn clothing and modest seat. Richard Thornton glanced at her again, his expression softening slightly. Whatever judgment he'd made about her financial situation seemed less important now that she appeared to be sleeping. Even Dr. Elena Rodriguez found herself hoping the woman would get some rest. The stress lines around her eyes suggested someone carrying burdens that went beyond simple fatigue. Flight attendant Maria Santos moved quietly through the cabin, checking on passengers and preparing for the in-flight service. When she passed row 10, she paused to observe Jessica's sleeping form. Something about her stillness reminded her of sailors she'd treated during her Navy Medical Corps service. The particular way combat veterans learn to find rest whenever and wherever possible. But Maria kept her observations to herself, continuing her rounds as Flight 623 flew steadily northeast through the night sky. The aircraft was pressurized at 8,000 feet equivalent altitude. The cabin temperature was a comfortable 72 degrees, and all systems were functioning normally. It was exactly the kind of routine flight that airline passengers expected and crew members preferred. What none of them could see was the massive storm system developing ahead of their flight path, a meteorological monster that was defying every computer model and exceeding every forecast. Within the next hour, Flight 623 would encounter conditions that would test every system aboard the aircraft and every skill possessed by its crew. Jessica Stone slept on, unaware that her military training, her combat experience, and her hard-won knowledge of emergency procedures were about to become the difference between life and death for 167 souls flying through the night toward an appointment with disaster. The mountain peaks below them were already disappearing under a blanket of clouds that glowed with the strange luminescence that comes from lightning trapped within ice crystals. The storm was building, growing stronger with each minute, and Flight 623 was flying directly into its path. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you're enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. 38 minutes into the flight, Captain Martinez felt the first wave of chest pain wash over him like a crushing weight. He gripped the control yoke tighter, trying to breathe through the sensation as the cockpit instruments seemed to blur at the edges. The pain lasted only a few seconds, but it left him unsettled in a way that 18 years of commercial flying had never prepared him for. "Everything okay, Captain?" Ashley Chen asked, glancing over from her navigation display where she'd been tracking the weather system developing ahead of their route. "Just tired," Martinez replied, though the metallic taste in his mouth and the cold sweat on his forehead suggested something more serious. "Long day yesterday, and this weather situation has me concerned." Ashley returned to her instruments, but she'd caught the strain in Martinez's voice, the way his breathing had become shallow and rapid. As a newer pilot, she had been trained to watch for signs of crew fatigue or medical issues, but confronting a senior captain about potential problems required careful consideration. In the cabin behind them, Jessica Stone had settled into the light sleep that military training had taught her to achieve anywhere, anytime. Her breathing was slow and regular, but her subconscious remained alert to changes in the aircraft's sound or movement. Years of flying combat missions had conditioned her to sleep with one part of her mind always monitoring for threats. The elderly couple in 8A and 8B were sharing family photos on their phone. Their quiet conversation was a gentle murmur beneath the engine noise. Harold and Dorothy Peterson had been married for 47 years, and this trip to Denver was their first vacation in over 3 years. Harold's recent retirement from the fire department had finally given them the freedom to visit their scattered grandchildren.
"She's been sleeping since takeoff," Dorothy whispered, nodding toward Jessica. "Poor dear must be exhausted." Harold adjusted his reading glasses and glanced at Jessica's peaceful form. "Reminds me of our daughter when she was that age. Always good sleep anywhere." 2 rows ahead, Richard Thornton was reviewing quarterly financial reports on his laptop. The screen's blue glow illuminated his precisely groomed features. His investment firm had performed exceptionally well this year, and tomorrow's board meeting would likely result in substantial bonuses for senior partners. The success felt hollow, though. At 49, Richard had accumulated wealth beyond his childhood dreams, but the cost had been measured in failed relationships and a growing sense that financial achievement meant less than he'd expected. He glanced again at Jessica, irritated by his own fascination with her presence. Something about her stillness bothered him. The way she seemed completely at peace while surrounded by luxury she clearly couldn't afford. It challenged his fundamental beliefs about success and status in ways that made him uncomfortable. Dr. Elena Rodriguez was deep in a journal article about innovative trauma surgical techniques when the aircraft hit its first patch of turbulence. The sudden jolt was mild, but it caused her coffee cup to slide across her tray table. As she steadied the cup, Elena noticed that Jessica hadn't stirred, despite the movement. That level of sleep discipline typically came from military training or medical residency, situations where rest had to be grabbed whenever possible, regardless of circumstances. In row 15, Samantha Collins's 4-month-old son Michael began fussing as the atmospheric pressure changes affected his ears. Samantha tried to soothe him quietly, conscious of the other passengers trying to rest. The infant's soft cries carried through the cabin, and several travelers glanced back with expressions ranging from sympathy to annoyance. Flight attendant Carlos Medina noticed the disturbance and made his way down the aisle with practiced grace, despite the aircraft's slight swaying motion. "First flight with a baby?" he asked Samantha quietly. "Second, but he didn't cry last time. I think the pressure changes are bothering him." Carlos retrieved a small bottle of children's pain reliever from the medical kit. "This might help. Flying can be tough on little ears." As Carlos helped Samantha administer the medication, neither of them noticed the subtle changes occurring in the aircraft's movement. The autopilot was making small corrections more frequently, adjusting for wind patterns that were becoming increasingly erratic. The smooth flight was gradually becoming less smooth, though the changes were too gradual for passengers to notice consciously. In the cockpit, Martinez was fighting his own battle with escalating symptoms. The chest pain had returned, accompanied by a crushing sensation that made breathing difficult. His left arm felt heavy and numb, and cold sweat was beading on his forehead despite the cockpit's cool temperature. "Ashley," he said quietly, trying to keep the strain out of his voice, "I need you to take the controls for a few minutes." "Of course, Captain. I have the aircraft," Ashley replied, assuming Martinez needed a brief rest or wanted to review something in their flight manual. But when she glanced over at him, she saw his pale complexion and the way his hand pressed against his chest. "Captain Martinez, are you having chest pain?" she asked, her voice sharp with concern. Martinez nodded weakly, no longer able to maintain the pretense that he was simply tired. "I think I'm having a heart attack," he whispered. The words hit Ashley like a physical blow. In 16 months of commercial flying, she'd handled mechanical problems, weather deviations, and difficult passengers, but never a medical emergency involving the pilot in command. Her training had covered the procedures, but experiencing them in reality felt completely different. "Captain, I'm declaring a medical emergency," Ashley announced, reaching for the radio. "Denver Center, Flight 623, declaring medical emergency. We have pilot incapacitation and request immediate priority handling and clearance to nearest suitable airport." "Flight 623, Denver Center, copy your medical emergency. State nature of emergency and souls on board." "We have the captain experiencing cardiac symptoms and incapacitated. First officer assuming command. 167 souls on board. Fuel for approximately 100 minutes. As Ashley handled the emergency communications, Martinez slumped forward in his seat, his breathing becoming shallow and irregular. The captain who had seemed invincible just minutes earlier was now fighting for his life while his aircraft flew through increasingly dangerous weather. "Denver Center, Flight 623, we're also encountering severe weather development. Request vectors around the storm activity." "Flight 623, we're showing significant weather development over your route. Recommend immediate deviation to heading 090 and descent to flight level 280 to avoid the worst of the system." Ashley's hands were steady on the controls, but her mind was racing. She was now solely responsible for an aircraft carrying 167 people, flying toward a storm system that was intensifying faster than anyone had predicted. Her training had prepared her for this scenario in theory, but the reality felt overwhelming. In the cabin, passengers were beginning to notice the increasing turbulence. Jessica's eyes opened as the aircraft hit a particularly sharp bump, her pilot instincts instantly alert. Something in the aircraft's movement pattern told her they were dealing with more than routine mountain wave turbulence. Maria Santos was securing loose items in the galley when she felt the aircraft bank sharply to the right, a deviation that had not been announced to the cabin crew. Her military medical training had taught her to recognize when routine situations were becoming emergencies, and the aircraft's current behavior suggested significant problems developing. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing some weather-related turbulence," Ashley's voice came over the intercom, but her tone carried stress that contradicted her calm words. As someone who'd flown combat missions where split-second decisions meant the difference between success and catastrophe, Jessica recognized the sound of a pilot operating at the edge of her experience level. The turbulence intensified, causing overhead bins to rattle and several passengers to gasp in alarm. Emma Rodriguez clutched her stuffed elephant tighter, looking around the cabin with wide, frightened eyes. The gentle rocking motion that had lulled many passengers to sleep was now replaced with sharp jolts and sudden drops that made stomachs lurch. "This doesn't feel normal," Richard Thornton muttered, closing his laptop as another sharp bump nearly sent it sliding off his tray table. He looked toward the front of the aircraft, wondering if the crew was going to provide more information about what was happening. Dr. Elena Rodriguez was fighting her own concerns as she recognized the signs of an aircraft in distress. The engine sounds were changing subtly, the cabin pressure felt different, and the flight attendant's body language suggested they were dealing with more than routine turbulence. In row 15, Samantha's 4-month-old son, Michael, began fussing again, his distress adding to the growing tension in the cabin. Samantha tried to comfort her son while fighting her own rising panic. As a single mother, she'd learned to stay calm during difficult situations, but being trapped in an aircraft experiencing severe problems triggered fears she couldn't easily suppress.
Jessica's eyes swept the cabin, taking in the nervous passengers, the flight attendants' forced calm, and the increasingly violent motion of the aircraft. Her right hand gripped the armrest, the nervous tapping more pronounced now due to stress, but her mind was crystal clear. Every instinct she'd developed during 400 combat flight hours was telling her that Flight 623 was in serious trouble. The storm ahead of them had now reached Category 5 intensity, with wind speeds exceeding 180 miles per hour and hail the size of tennis balls. What had started as a minor weather disturbance was now a meteorological disaster that posed a direct threat to any aircraft attempting to fly through it. And in the cockpit, First Officer Ashley Chen was running out of options for avoiding the storm while dealing with an incapacitated captain and an aircraft that was becoming increasingly difficult to control. As they encountered the outer edges of the weather system, lightning exploded outside the cockpit windows as Flight 623 plunged into the heart of the storm system. Ashley Chan fought the controls as wind shears grabbed the Boeing 777 and shook it like a child's toy. The aircraft dropped 600 feet in 4 seconds, then shot upward just as violently. Warning alarms screamed from every corner of the instrument panel. "Denver Center, Flight 623 requesting immediate emergency descent," Ashley called into her headset, her voice tight with concentration. "We're encountering severe turbulence and wind shear. Captain Martinez is unconscious and unresponsive." "Flight 623, Denver Center, cleared to descend flight level 240. Be advised we're losing radar contact due to weather interference. Squawk emergency code 7700. Captain Martinez lay slumped against his restraints, his face gray and slick with perspiration. His breathing came in short, labored gasps that Ashley could hear even over the storm's fury. She'd activated the emergency medical kit's oxygen supply, but without proper medical training, there was little else she could do for him. The weather radar display showed solid red directly ahead, indicating precipitation so heavy it could overwhelm the engines. Hail reports were coming in from other aircraft, describing ice chunks large enough to crack windscreens and dent wing surfaces. Ashley had never flown through conditions remotely this severe. "Maria, I need you in the cockpit," Ashley called back to the senior flight attendant through the intercom. "Medical assistance required." Maria Santos unbuckled from her jump seat and made her way forward, using the walls for support as the aircraft bucked through the turbulence. Her Navy corpsman training had prepared her for medical emergencies, but not at 37,000 feet in the middle of a storm. When Maria reached the cockpit, she immediately assessed Captain Martinez's condition. Weak pulse, shallow breathing, skin cold and clammy.
Classic signs of cardiac distress, possibly a massive heart attack. Maria began checking vitals while Ashley continued fighting the storm. "How is he?" Ashley asked, not daring to take her eyes off the instruments as another violent downdraft sent the aircraft plummeting. "Stable but critical," Maria replied. "He needs immediate medical attention. How far to Denver at this rate?" "Maybe 40 minutes if we can maintain course, but I don't think we can fly through this storm much longer." The aircraft shuddered as golf ball-sized hail began hammering the fuselage. Through the cockpit windows, Ashley could see ice accumulating on the wing surfaces, disrupting the airflow patterns that kept them aloft. Engine number 1 began showing warning indications as ice built up in the intake. In the cabin, passengers were no longer trying to maintain their calm composure. The violent motion had awakened everyone, and the sound of hail striking the aircraft's aluminum skin created a terrifying percussion that echoed through the passenger compartment. "What's happening?" Harold Peterson called out to flight attendant Carlos Medina as he struggled down the aisle, checking that passengers remained securely fastened in their seats. "We're experiencing severe weather, sir," Carlos replied, his trained smile not quite masking the concern in his voice. "Please keep your seatbelt tight and try to remain calm." Richard Thornton's laptop had slammed shut during one of the violent jolts, and his carefully organized financial documents were scattered across his seat area. For the first time in years, his wealth felt irrelevant. Money couldn't control weather or fix whatever was wrong with their aircraft. 9-year-old Emma Rodriguez pressed her face against the window, watching lightning fork through the clouds below them. She wasn't crying, but her knuckles were white as she gripped her stuffed elephant. The storm looked like something from a movie, beautiful and terrifying simultaneously. "Are we going to crash?" Emma asked Carlos as the flight attendant checked her seatbelt. "No, sweetheart. The pilots are very experienced and they know how to handle storms like this," Carlos replied, although his own confidence was wavering as the turbulence grew worse. Jessica's eyes snapped open as the aircraft hit an air pocket that sent her stomach into her throat. Her pilot's brain immediately began processing the sensory information. Engine sound patterns, aircraft attitude changes, the particular vibration that came from severe weather encounters. This wasn't normal turbulence. This was the kind of weather that destroyed aircraft. She sat up, automatically checking her seatbelt tension and scanning the cabin for signs of structural stress. Other passengers were gripping armrests and looking around nervously, but none showed the systematic assessment that came from aviation training. The aircraft lurched violently to the left, and Jessica heard the distinct sound of metal stress as the airframe flexed beyond normal parameters. Her right hand began the nervous tapping against the armrest, but her mind was calculating wind speeds, turbulence intensity, and structural load factors with the precision of someone who'd flown through combat conditions. Dr. Elena Rodriguez was fighting motion sickness as the aircraft pitched and rolled through the storm. As a surgeon, she was accustomed to maintaining steady hands under pressure, but the violent motion made it impossible to focus on anything except survival. She noticed that Jessica seemed remarkably composed despite the chaos, sitting upright with the alert posture of someone prepared for action. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is First Officer Chen speaking," Ashley called over the intercom. "We're encountering severe weather and are taking steps to ensure your safety. Please remain in your seats with seatbelts securely fastened." What Ashley didn't announce was that engine number 1 was now showing serious warning signs, that their weather radar had failed completely, and that she was flying essentially blind through one of the most dangerous storm systems she'd ever encountered. Samantha Collins held her baby son close, whispering prayers in Spanish as the aircraft shook around them. Michael had stopped crying, perhaps sensing his mother's fear, and now clung silently to Samantha's sweater. Around them, other passengers were beginning to show signs of real panic. "This is not normal turbulence," Richard Thornton announced to no one in particular.
his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being heard. "Something is seriously wrong with this flight." His words triggered a wave of nervous murmurs throughout the cabin. Passengers who had been trying to maintain their composure now began expressing their fears openly.
"Are we going to make it?" an elderly woman called out. "Where are the pilots? Why aren't they telling us what's happening?" demanded a middle-aged man in a business suit. Maria Santos returned to the cabin, her face grim. She moved quickly to the intercom, knowing that the passengers needed information, but also that panic could make an already dangerous situation catastrophic. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have encountered a medical emergency involving one of our pilots," Maria Karan announced, her voice carrying the calm authority of someone trained to handle crisis situations. "First Officer Chen is safely operating the aircraft, but we are also dealing with severe weather conditions." The admission sent a chill through the cabin. Passengers exchanged frightened glances, and several people began reaching for their phones, despite the lack of cellular service at altitude. "We need immediate assistance from anyone aboard with aviation experience," Maria continued. "If there are any pilots, military aviators, flight instructors, or air traffic controllers among our passengers, please identify yourselves immediately." Jessica's heart began racing, but not from fear. For the first time in 4 years, her specialized training was desperately needed. Every instinct told her to respond, but the memory of her medical discharge held her back. What if her stress reactions interfered at a critical moment? What if she made the situation worse? Around the cabin, passengers looked at each other hopefully, searching for anyone who might have the expertise to help, but no one stood up. No one raised their hand. The silence stretched painfully as the aircraft continued its violent dance with the storm. Harold Peterson leaned toward his wife, Dorothy. "Surely someone on this plane knows how to fly," he whispered. "Maybe they're too scared to admit it," Dorothy replied, her own voice shaking as another lightning flash illuminated the cabin. Dr. Elena Rodriguez was studying Jessica's face, noting the way her eyes tracked the aircraft's movements, the unconscious way she monitored engine sounds, the particular alertness that suggested extensive aviation knowledge. "Miss," Elena said quietly, leaning across the aisle toward Jessica, "you're a pilot, aren't you?" Jessica met her gaze, and for a moment, the pretense fell away. "Former pilot," she said quietly. "These people need your help," Elena pressed. "Whatever kept you from flying before, it can't be more important than 167 lives." The aircraft dropped again, this time falling nearly 700 feet before Ashley could arrest the descent. Screams echoed through the cabin as passengers felt weightlessness, followed by crushing gravitational force. Several overhead bins popped open, spilling luggage into the aisles. Jessica looked toward the cockpit, where she could see Ashley struggling with the controls that seemed to have a mind of their own. The first officer was competent, but she was fighting a battle that required experience Jessica had earned through years of flying in conditions where mistakes meant death. "I was medically discharged," Jessica said to Dr. Rodriguez, her voice barely audible over the storm. "Post-traumatic stress, anxiety reactions. They said I was unfit for flight operations." "Can you still fly?" Elena asked directly. Jessica looked at her tapping fingers, then at the frightened faces around her. Emma Rodriguez was crying now, her small body pressed against the window as she searched for any sign that they would survive. Samantha Collins was whispering prayers while holding her baby, and even Richard Thornton's arrogant composure had cracked completely. "I don't know," Jessica admitted, "but I'm about to find out." Jessica Stone unbuckled her seatbelt and stood, her movement deliberate despite the aircraft's violent pitching. The cabin erupted in a cacophony of groaning metal and terrified passengers as another massive downdraft sent loose items flying through the air. A service cart broke free from its restraints and crashed into the galley wall with a sound like gunfire. "I'm a pilot,"
Jessica called out to Maria Santos, her voice cutting through the chaos. "Former Air Force, F-16 combat missions in Syria." Richard Thornton twisted in his seat, staring at Jessica with undisguised disbelief. The woman who'd been sleeping peacefully in worn clothing was claiming to be a military pilot? "You've got to be kidding me," he said loudly enough for several rows to hear. "Look at her." Maria studied Jessica's face, searching for any sign of deception or desperation. Military bearing was difficult to fake, and something in Jessica's steady gaze convinced her she was telling the truth. "Ma'am, the cockpit is this way, quickly." "Wait just a minute." Richard stood up, ignoring the flight attendant's instructions to remain seated. "You're going to trust our lives to someone who looks like she can barely afford a bus ticket? I demand to speak with someone in authority." Jessica paused, meeting Richard's hostile stare. "Sir, your captain is having a heart attack. Your first officer is flying solo through the worst storm she's ever seen, and this aircraft is being torn apart by wind shears. Would you prefer to discuss my wardrobe, or would you like to live through the next hour?" The directness of her response silenced Richard, but his expression remained skeptical. Around the cabin, other passengers were listening to the exchange with growing alarm. The revelation that their captain was incapacitated sent waves of panic through the rows. "A heart attack?" Samantha Collins clutched her baby tighter, her voice rising with fear. "Does that mean we're going to crash?" "Nobody's crashing on my watch," Jessica replied, though her right hand betrayed her with nervous tapping as she gripped the seat back for balance. She hoped no one else noticed, but Dr. Elena Rodriguez was watching her carefully. The aircraft suddenly banked hard to the right, throwing Jessica against the wall as Ashley fought to regain control. Through the cockpit door, they could hear alarms blaring and Ashley's voice calling out altitude readings in the clipped tone of someone operating at the edge of panic. "Flight level 220 and descending. Weather radar is completely obscured. Flying on instruments only." Jessica pushed forward through the turbulence. Her muscle memory from combat operations allowed her to move efficiently despite the aircraft's erratic motion. Behind her, she could hear Richard Thornton arguing with Maria about allowing an unqualified person into the cockpit. "She's not even in uniform. How do we know she's actually a pilot? This could be some kind of breakdown or delusion." Dr. Elena Rodriguez stood up carefully, using her medical authority to cut through the argument. "I've worked with military pilots before. This woman has the bearing and responses of someone with extensive aviation experience. Right now, experience is exactly what we need." "Thank you, Doctor," Jessica said without looking back. She reached the cockpit door and paused, taking a deep breath. It had been 4 years since she'd sat in a pilot's seat. 4 years since the medical board had declared her unfit for flight duties. Her right hand was tapping nervously now, the stress triggering the anxiety responses that ended her military career. The cockpit door opened, and Jessica got her first clear view of the crisis. Captain Martinez was unconscious, his head lolled to one side, oxygen mask covering his face. First Officer Ashley was fighting the controls with both hands, sweat streaming down her face as she battled wind shears that were trying to flip their aircraft inverted. "Thank God," Ashley gasped when she saw Jessica. "Are you really Air Force?" "Former Air Force. Captain Jessica Stone, call sign Viper, 400 combat hours in F-16s before medical discharge." "Medical discharge?" Ashley's voice carried new concern. "What kind of medical issue?" Jessica held up her tapping hand. "Post-traumatic stress. Sometimes affects decision-making and stress responses. They said it was a flight safety risk." For a moment, Ashley hesitated. The idea of trusting their lives to a pilot with documented psychological problems seemed like exchanging one crisis for another. But as the aircraft dropped another 400 feet in 3 seconds, she realized they were beyond the luxury of perfect solutions. "Can you still fly?" Ashley asked directly. "I'm about to find out," Jessica replied, studying the instrument panel. What she saw made her stomach clench.
They were flying blind through a storm system that was generating wind shears capable of destroying any aircraft. Engine number 1 was showing ice accumulation warnings. Their weather radar was completely whitewashed, and they were burning fuel at an unsustainable rate while fighting the turbulence. "Flight Officer Chen, what's our current position and fuel status?" Jessica asked, her voice tight with concentration. "Last known position was approximately 120 miles northeast of Albuquerque, but that was before we started deviating for weather. Fuel remaining is about 14,000 pounds, maybe 50 minutes at current consumption." Jessica felt the familiar calm that had descended during her most dangerous combat missions. When everything was falling apart, when technology failed and normal procedures became useless, training and experience became the only reliable guides.
"Ashley, I need you to reduce power on both engines and let the aircraft settle into the turbulence instead of fighting it," Jessica instructed. "You're burning fuel and stressing the airframe by trying to maintain precise altitude." "But procedure says to maintain assigned altitude," Ashley protested. "Procedure assumes normal weather conditions. Right now, we need to survive the storm first and worry about air traffic control later." As Ashley reduced power, the aircraft's motion became less violent. They were still being tossed around, but the engines weren't screaming against the downdrafts anymore. Jessica's advice was working, but she could see the doubt in Ashley's eyes. Back in the cabin, Richard Thornton had enlisted Dr. Elena Rodriguez in his campaign to question Jessica's qualifications. "Doctor, surely you can see this is madness. We're trusting our lives to someone who admits she's medically unfit to fly." Elena studied Richard's agitated face, then looked toward the cockpit where Jessica was working. "Mr. Thornton, I've seen combat veterans operate under extreme stress. Sometimes experience trumps perfect health. But her hands are shaking. How can someone with anxiety disorders fly an airplane?" "The same way surgeons with arthritis perform operations: adaptation, compensation, and 20 years of muscle memory." Emma Rodriguez had been listening to the adults argue, and now she spoke up in her clear child voice. "The nice lady is helping the pilots. That's good, right?" Her innocent question silenced the argument. Even Richard found himself without a response to 9-year-old logic. In the cockpit, Jessica was studying weather reports from other aircraft in the area. The news was uniformly bad. 4 commercial flights had already diverted to emergency airports, and 1 military transport had declared an emergency after losing an engine to hail damage. "Ashley, we need to get below this weather layer. Request descent to flight level 150. "That's only 15,000 feet. We'll be in the mountains." "The mountains are our friend right now. The storm structure should be less severe at lower altitude, and we can navigate visually once we get below the cloud deck." Ashley keyed her radio. "Denver Center, Flight 623 requesting emergency descent to flight level 150. Flight 623 unable to approve flight level 150. Minimum safe altitude for your position is flight level 200 due to terrain." Jessica reached for the radio microphone. "Denver Center, this is Captain Jessica Stone, United States Air Force. I'm assisting Flight 623's crew with emergency operations. We have pilot incapacitation, severe weather encounter, and are declaring emergency authority to descend below minimum safe altitude." There was a long pause from air traffic control. "Flight 623, did you say Air Force Captain Stone?" "Affirmative. Former F-16 pilot taking emergency action to save this aircraft." "Captain Stone, this is Major General Patricia Hayes, Air Force Liaison at Denver Center. We show your service record indicates medical retirement. Are you qualified for this operation?" Jessica closed her eyes briefly. General Hayes had been her wing commander during her final tour, one of the few people who'd supported her appeal of the medical discharge decision. "Hello, General," Jessica said quietly. "My medical condition hasn't changed, but my flight experience is still valid." The radio silence stretched for 10 seconds before General Hayes's voice crackled back through the static-filled transmission.
Jessica, I remember your capabilities. You have emergency clearance for any altitude you deem necessary. We're clearing all traffic from a 100-mile radius. Thank you, General, Jessica replied, her fingers already moving across the instrument panel as she assessed their critical situation. We need direct routing to the nearest military field capable of handling a 777 in zero visibility conditions. Stand by, Viper, Hayes responded, using her old call sign automatically. I'm pulling up suitable airfields now. Ashley Chen stared at Jessica with a mixture of relief and apprehension. The transformation in the cockpit's atmosphere was immediate and dramatic. Where moments before she'd been fighting the storm alone with an unconscious captain, now she had backup from someone who spoke with the authority of extensive experience. Captain Stone, what do you need from me? Ashley asked, relinquishing primary control of the aircraft without hesitation. Keep monitoring our engine parameters and fuel flow. Call out any warning lights or system failures immediately. We're going to hand fly this aircraft out of the storm using techniques they don't teach in commercial aviation. The difference in aircraft handling was immediate and dramatic. Where Ashley had been fighting the turbulence with large control inputs that stressed the airframe, Jessica worked with the wind shears, making small adjustments that allowed the aircraft to ride the atmospheric waves rather than battling them. Her F-16 training had taught her to think of severe weather as just another adversary to be outmaneuvered rather than overpowered. In the cabin behind them, passengers noticed the change in flight characteristics, even if they couldn't identify what was different. The violent jolting motion was replaced by a more controlled movement, still rough but no longer threatening to tear the aircraft apart. Maria Santos moved through the passenger compartment, checking for injuries and trying to maintain calm despite the ongoing emergency. When she reached Richard Thornton's seat, the businessman grabbed her arm. "That woman has no business in the cockpit," he hissed. "I've been flying commercial for 15 years as a passenger, and I've never seen anything like this. She's going to kill us all." "Sir, she's our best option right now. The captain is unconscious, and our first officer requested assistance. Captain Stone has the training we need." "Captain," Richard's voice pitched higher with indignation. "She's wearing a thrift store jacket and boots that belong on a construction site. How do we know she's actually military?" Dr. Elena Rodriguez leaned across the aisle, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to life-and-death decisions. "Mr. Thornton, I've worked with military personnel for 12 years. That woman's responses and bearing are consistent with combat aviation experience. Her medical condition does not negate her training." "Medical condition?" Richard seized on the phrase. "What medical condition? Are you telling me we're trusting our lives to someone who's medically unfit to fly?" Before Elena could respond, 9-year-old Emma Rodriguez's voice cut through the argument with the clarity that only children possess. "The nice lady is helping the pilot lady. That's good, right?" Her innocent question silenced the argument. Even Richard found himself without a response to 9-year-old logic. In the cockpit, Jessica was studying weather reports from other aircraft in the area. The news was uniformly bad. 4 commercial flights had already diverted to emergency airports, and 1 military transport had declared an emergency after losing an engine to hail damage. "Ashley, we need to get below this weather layer. Request descent to flight level 150. "That's only 15,000 feet. We'll be in the mountains." "The mountains are our friend right now. The storm structure should be less severe at lower altitude, and we can navigate visually once we get below the cloud deck." Ashley keyed her radio. "Denver Center, Flight 623 requesting emergency descent to flight level 150. Flight 623 unable to approve flight level 150. Minimum safe altitude for your position is flight level 200 due to terrain." Jessica reached for the radio microphone. "Denver Center, this is Captain Jessica Stone, United States Air Force. I'm assisting Flight 623's crew with emergency operations. We have pilot incapacitation, severe weather encounter, and are declaring emergency authority to descend below minimum safe altitude." There was a long pause from air traffic control. Flight 623, did you say Air Force Captain Stone? Affirmative. Former F-16 pilot taking emergency action to save this aircraft. Captain Stone, this is Major General Patricia Hayes, Air Force Liaison at Denver Center. We show your service record indicates medical retirement. Are you qualified for this operation? Jessica closed her eyes briefly. General Hayes had been her wing commander during her final tour, one of the few people who'd supported her appeal of the medical discharge decision. "Hello, General," Jessica said quietly. "My medical condition hasn't changed, but my flight experience is still valid." The radio silence stretched for 10 seconds before General Hayes's voice crackled back through the static-filled transmission. "Jessica, I remember your capabilities. You have emergency clearance for any altitude you deem necessary. We're clearing all traffic from a 100-mile radius." "Thank you, General," Jessica replied, her fingers already moving across the instrument panel as she assessed their critical situation. "We need direct routing to the nearest military field capable of handling a 777 in zero visibility conditions." "Stand by, Viper," Hayes responded, using her old call sign automatically. "I'm pulling up suitable airfields now." Ashley Chen stared at Jessica with a mixture of relief and apprehension. The transformation in the cockpit's atmosphere was immediate and dramatic. Where moments before she'd been fighting the storm alone with an unconscious captain, now she had backup from someone who spoke with the authority of extensive experience. "Captain Stone, what do you need from me?" Ashley asked, relinquishing primary control of the aircraft without hesitation. "Keep monitoring our engine parameters and fuel flow. Call out any warning lights or system failures immediately. We're going to hand fly."
Flight 623. Peterson is 180 miles southeast of your last known position. Current weather there is marginal but improving. Winds 320 degrees at 30 knots, gusting to 45. Visibility 3 miles and snow showers. "We'll take it," Jessica replied. "What's the current approach minimums?" "Precision approach runway 35. Minimums are 300 feet and 1 mile visibility." Ashley's face went pale. "Captain Stone, I've never attempted an approach in conditions that marginal. My minimum experience is 500 feet and 2 miles. "Then today you're going to learn something new," Jessica said, adjusting their heading toward Peterson. "Combat aviation teaches you that sometimes the only option is the one that scares you most." Jessica's right hand began working the throttles, compensating for engine power variations caused by ice accumulation. Her nervous tapping was more pronounced now, but her movements remained precise and deliberate. Years of flying in combat zones had taught her to function effectively even when her body wasn't cooperating perfectly. "Engine number 1 is showing fluctuating power output," Ashley reported. "Ice accumulation in the intake is affecting compression ratios." "Copy that. We'll keep number 1 online as long as possible, but be prepared for single-engine approach procedures if it fails completely." The casual way Jessica discussed potentially losing an engine sent chills through Ashley's spine. Commercial pilots trained for engine failures, but they were typically practiced in simulators under controlled conditions, not during actual emergencies in severe weather. Samantha Collins was trying to keep her baby calm when another passenger, a middle-aged insurance executive named Robert Hayes, leaned over from across the aisle. "Ma'am, I think we should demand to speak with the real pilot. The situation is completely unacceptable." "The real pilot is unconscious," Samantha replied, exhaustion creeping into her voice. "At least someone's trying to help us." "Someone completely unqualified," Robert pressed. "Look at her. She looks like she sleeps in bus stations." Harold Peterson turned around from his seat 2 rows ahead, his normally gentle voice sharp with irritation. "Son, I flew cargo planes in Vietnam for 3 tours. That woman moves like a pilot, talks like a pilot, and right now she's the only thing standing between us and a smoking hole in the ground. I suggest you shut your mouth and let her work." The rebuke from a fellow veteran carried weight that silenced Robert's complaints, at least temporarily. Harold had recognized something in Jessica's bearing that civilian passengers missed. The particular confidence that came from making life-and-death decisions under extreme pressure.
Jessica was working with General Hayes to establish their exact position using radio navigation aids that predated satellite navigation technology. Without weather radar or reliable satellite navigation, they were effectively flying using techniques that World War II pilots would have recognized. Viper, I'm showing you approximately 160 miles northeast of Peterson based on radio bearings. Be advised, there are multiple aircraft declaring emergencies in your area. The storm system has exceeded all forecast models. General, how many aircraft are we talking about? 6 commercial flights and 3 military transports. This storm caught everyone by surprise. Jessica absorbed this information while continuing to hand-fly the aircraft through the turbulence. If multiple aircraft were in distress, emergency response resources would be stretched thin. They couldn't count on extensive ground support or priority handling. Ashley, I need you to start calculating single-engine approach speeds and minimum fuel requirements for Peterson. If we lose engine number 1, we'll need every advantage we can get. Captain Stone, I've never actually performed a single-engine approach in a 777. The singulator training was theoretical only. Then today, they're going to get the best education in emergency procedures you'll ever receive. Combat flying teaches you that theory and reality are 2 different things. As Jessica spoke, her right hand began tapping more rapidly against the throttles, the stress response intensifying as they approached the most critical phase of their emergency. She took a deep breath, using the anxiety management techniques learned during her recovery from combat trauma. Captain, are you sure you can handle the controls? Maria asked quietly, having returned to the cockpit to check on Captain Martinez. She looked at her tapping fingers, then at the storm raging outside the cockpit windows. Maria, 4 years ago, I was flying close air support missions in Syria, when enemy fire nearly brought down my aircraft. The doctor said I'd never fly again. Tonight, 167 people are depending on skills I learned in combat zones where hesitation meant death. My hand may be nervous, but my judgment is solid. The conviction in her voice convinced Maria, but she could see continued doubt in Ashley's expression. The first officer was young enough to believe that perfection was a requirement for success, inexperienced enough to think that physical limitations always trumped mental capabilities. First Officer Chen, I need to know if you can follow my instructions even when they contradict your training. What I'm about to ask you to do will seem wrong, dangerous, and possibly suicidal, but it's based on experience flying through weather that would ground every commercial pilot in the world. Ashley met Jessica's steady gaze and saw something there that reminded her of her own instructors during flight training. Authority earned through experience, rather than rank. I'll follow your lead, Captain Stone. Just tell me what you need. The aircraft shuddered violently as they descended through 18,000 feet, entering the lower reaches of the storm where visibility dropped to near zero. Jessica was flying entirely on instruments, her movements guided by muscle memory developed through hundreds of hours in combat conditions where electronic warfare made normal navigation impossible.
Engine number 1 just flamed out, Ashley announced, her voice tight with controlled panic. Ice ingestion caused compressor stall. We're on single engine. Jessica's response was immediate and decisive. Secure engine number 1. Maintain minimum single engine speed. Recalculate fuel consumption for Peterson approach. Ashley, this is why combat pilots train for worst-case scenarios. 1 engine, no weather radar, questionable navigation. Just another Tuesday in Syria. Her casual tone while describing their dire situation helped calm Ashley's rising panic. If Jessica could treat engine failure during a storm as routine, maybe they actually had a chance of survival. In the cabin, passengers felt the aircraft's motion change as it transitioned to single-engine flight. The steady twin-engine hum was replaced by a different sound pattern that made everyone acutely aware something significant had occurred. Richard Thornton unbuckled his seatbelt despite Maria's earlier instructions and pushed toward the cockpit. "I demand to know what's happening. That's not normal engine sound." Maria blocked his path with the practiced authority of someone who dealt with panicked soldiers under fire. "Sir, return to your seat immediately. We have multiple emergencies developing, and passenger interference could prove fatal." "I'm not going to sit here while some delusional woman experiments with our lives," Richard shouted loud enough for most of the cabin to hear. The accusation triggered angry responses from several other passengers. Harold Peterson stood up carefully, his Vietnam veteran status giving him credibility that silenced the nearby arguments. "Son, I've seen real pilots under pressure, and I've seen wannabes fold when things get serious," Harold said with absolute conviction. "That woman up there is saving our lives right now. If you can't see that, you're too stupid to deserve survival." Samantha Collins bounced her crying baby while listening to the arguments swirling around her. Her own fears were overwhelming, but something about Jessica's calm competence gave her hope. "She knows what she's doing. I can feel it." Dr. Elena Rodriguez was monitoring the conversation while simultaneously listening to radio chatter bleeding through the cockpit door. As someone who'd worked in trauma surgery, she understood that expertise often came in unexpected packages. "The woman has extensive training," Elena announced to the nearby passengers. "Her medical condition is manageable, and her experience is exactly what we need." Meanwhile, Jessica was executing a descent through cloud layers that would have been considered impossible under normal circumstances. She was using mountain wave patterns and wind shear signatures to navigate by feel, techniques that existed nowhere in commercial aviation manuals. Peterson approach. Flight 263 declaring emergency. Single engine, pilot incapacitation, 167 souls on board. Request immediate precision approach runway 35. Flight 263, Peterson approach. We have emergency equipment standing by. Current weather is 400 feet overcast, visibility 2 miles in moderate snow. Winds 320 at 35 knots, gusting to 50 knots. Approach minimums are 301 mile. Can you accept these conditions? Jessica studied their fuel remaining and calculated approach speeds for single-engine configuration. The margins were razor-thin, with no room for missed approaches or extended patterns. Peterson approach, we accept. Be advised, we have an Air Force pilot aboard providing emergency assistance. Flight 263, Roger. Be further advised, we have General Hayes coordinating emergency response. You're cleared for immediate approach runway 35. Emergency equipment is positioned and standing by. As they established on the approach course, Jessica's military training took complete control. She'd made dozens of combat approaches under fire, landing on damaged runways with wounded crew members and failing systems. This approach was challenging, but it was also exactly the kind of situation her entire career had prepared her for. Ashley, call out our altitude every 100 feet below 1,000. Watch our single-engine approach speed. If we get slow, we're dead. 1,000 feet, on glide slope, speed 155 knots, Ashley announced, her voice steadier now that she had specific tasks to focus on. 900 feet, still on glide slope. Engine 2 parameters look good. Jessica's right hand was tapping rapidly as she adjusted the throttles, but she pushed through the anxiety response, making the delicate power corrections required for single-engine flight. Her left hand maintained precise control of the aircraft's attitude, while her feet worked the rudder pedals to counteract the asymmetric thrust. 600 feet, breaking out of the clouds. I can see the runway lights. Peterson's runway appeared through the snow like a lifeline, its approach lights cutting through the darkness with mathematical precision. Jessica had landed at this base before during her Air Force career, but never under these conditions. 200 feet, on speed, on glide slope. Jessica's hands moved with the fluid precision of someone whose muscle memory had been forged in combat. The touchdown was firm but controlled, and she immediately deployed reverse thrust on the single operating engine while applying maximum braking. We're down, Jessica announced quietly, and the cockpit erupted in relieved celebration from Ashley and Maria. But Jessica knew the real test was just beginning. General Hayes would be waiting with questions she wasn't sure she was ready to answer, and 167 passengers had just witnessed something that would change how they thought about courage, competence, and the value of human experience. Forever. Emergency vehicles surrounded Flight 263 before the engines had fully spun down, their red and blue lights painting the snow-covered tarmac in brilliant patterns. The woman who'd been dismissed as nobody had just saved everyone aboard, proving that true heroism often comes in the most unexpected packages.
Emergency vehicles surrounded Flight 623 before the engines had fully spun down, their red and blue lights painting the snow-covered tarmac in kaleidoscope patterns. Paramedics rushed toward the aircraft with stretchers and medical equipment, while fire crews positioned themselves strategically around the Boeing 777's damaged frame. Ice still clung to the wing surfaces, and scorch marks from lightning strikes were visible along the fuselage. Jessica Stone remained in the pilot's seat, her hands still gripping the controls despite the fact that they were safely on the ground. The nervous tapping in her right hand had intensified during the final approach, and now stress-induced tremors were radiating up to her shoulder. She closed her eyes and focused on breathing techniques learned during her recovery from combat trauma. "Captain Stone, that was the most incredible piece of flying I've ever witnessed," Ashley Chen said, her voice filled with genuine admiration. "The way you navigated that approach with zero visibility and single engine, I didn't think it was possible." Combat aviation teaches you that impossible is just another word for dangerous. Every landing you walk away from is a good landing, regardless of how it looks on paper. Through the cockpit windows, they could see General Patricia Hayes striding across the tarmac, her uniform crisp despite the blowing snow. Even at a distance, her command presence was unmistakable. Jessica hadn't seen her former wing commander in person since the medical board hearing that had officially ended her military career. Maria Santos was coordinating with the medical team as they prepared to evacuate Captain Martinez. The pilot's vital signs had stabilized during the flight, but he remained unconscious and would require immediate cardiac intervention. Paramedics are ready to board. They want to get Captain Martinez to the hospital within 5 minutes. Clear them to board. Ashley, you did outstanding work tonight. Most commercial pilots with twice your experience would have lost control in those conditions. I was losing control. I just tried not to show it. Jessica smiled for the first time since the emergency began. Fear keeps you sharp as long as you don't let it paralyze your judgment. You'll be an excellent captain someday. As the medical team worked to stabilize and remove Captain Martinez, passengers began preparing to disembark. Many stopped to thank Jessica as they passed the cockpit, their earlier skepticism replaced by genuine gratitude. Harold Peterson paused to shake her hand, his grip firm despite his age. Vietnam, 1968 to 1971. C-130 transport missions. I recognize a combat pilot when I see one. Thank you for not giving up on us. Thank you for your support back there. It meant more than you know. Elena Rodriguez stopped next, her medical bag in hand. Your stress responses are consistent with managed post-traumatic stress. Have you been receiving proper treatment? Counseling when I can afford it. The Veterans Affairs Clinic is 2 hours from where I live. Elena pulled a business card from her wallet. I know specialists who work with combat trauma. Call me when you get settled. There are new treatments available. Richard Thornton approached last, his earlier arrogance replaced by visible shame. He stood in the cockpit doorway for several seconds before speaking. Captain Stone, I owe you an apology. I judged you based on your appearance and nearly interfered with you saving our lives. That was unforgivable. Jessica studied his face, seeing genuine remorse beneath the expensive suit and polished exterior. Mr. Thornton, fear makes people react in ways they don't normally do. What matters is that everyone's going home tonight. No, what I said was inexcusable, Richard insisted. I've spent my whole life believing that success was measured by what people owned rather than what they could accomplish. Tonight, you showed me how wrong I was. As the last passengers filed off the aircraft, Emma Rodriguez broke away from Carlos Medina and ran back to the cockpit. The 9-year-old threw her arms around Jessica's legs, her stuffed elephant clutched tightly in one hand. "Thank you for saving us. You are the bravest person I ever met." Jessica knelt down to Emma's level, her professional composure finally softening. "You were very brave too, sweetheart. You stayed calm when everyone was scared." Samantha Collins appeared behind Emma, her baby son sleeping peacefully in her arms. "Captain Stone, I don't have much money, but if there's ever anything I can do to repay you, just take care of your family. That's all the payment I need." As the cabin emptied, Jessica gathered her worn duffel bag and prepared to face the reunion she'd been avoiding for 4 years. General Hayes was waiting at the aircraft door, flanked by military police and intelligence officers whose presence suggested this encounter would be more than a casual conversation between former colleagues. "Jessica, we need to talk," General Hayes said as she stepped onto the jet bridge. They walked through the military terminal in silence, past walls lined with photographs of aircraft and crews that spanned decades of Air Force history. Jessica recognized many of the faces, pilots she'd trained with, commanders who'd shaped her understanding of military aviation, friends who died in combat operations around the world. General Hayes led her to a small conference room where coffee was waiting, along with a thick file folder marked with security classifications Jessica hadn't seen in years. 2 officers she didn't recognize sat at the table, their expressions professional but curious. "Jessica, this is Colonel Michael Torres from Air Force Personnel Command and Major Sarah Williams from the Pentagon's Pilot Retention Office. They have questions about your current status and tonight's events." Colonel Torres opened the file folder, revealing photographs from Jessica's service record, documentation of her combat missions, and details of her medical discharge. "Captain Stone, according to our records, you were medically retired due to post-traumatic stress and deemed unfit for flight operations. Yet tonight, you successfully completed one of the most challenging emergency procedures in commercial aviation history."
Jessica sat down across from them, her duffel bag at her feet, and for the first time in hours allowed her exhaustion to show. "Colonel, my medical condition hasn't changed. I still have anxiety responses and stress reactions that the medical board considered incompatible with flight safety. But those symptoms didn't prevent you from saving 167 lives," Major Williams pointed out. "Your performance tonight exceeded what most fully qualified pilots could have accomplished under the same conditions." General Hayes leaned forward, her expression intense. "Jessica, what you did tonight changes everything. Single-engine approach in zero visibility using dead reckoning navigation. That's not just exceptional flying. That's the kind of expertise we desperately need in our training programs." "Ma'am, I was discharged for good reason," Jessica replied. "My condition affects my performance under routine stress, not just emergency situations." "And yet you just managed the most stressful aviation emergency possible," Colonel Torres observed. "Perhaps our evaluation criteria don't account for how some people perform better under extreme pressure than routine operations." Major Williams pulled out another folder, this one containing contemporary documents. "Jessica, we've been studying the performance of pilots we've medically discharged over the past decade. We're finding that many of them, like you, still possess capabilities that exceed those of pilots we've kept on active duty." "What are you saying, Major?" "We're saying the Air Force is developing new programs for pilots with managed medical conditions, training positions, emergency response coordination, test pilot programs where experience matters more than perfect health." General Hayes pushed a document across the table. "Jessica, we're offering you reinstatement with promotion to Lieutenant Colonel and assignment as Chief of Emergency Procedures Training at Nellis Air Force Base. You would be responsible for teaching the next generation of pilots the kind of crisis management skills you demonstrated tonight." Jessica stared at the paperwork, hardly believing what she was reading.
"Ma'am, my medical condition hasn't improved. If anything, the stress of tonight made it worse." "Your condition is manageable," General Hayes replied, "and your experience is irreplaceable. We've learned that perfect psychological health doesn't always translate to perfect performance under impossible conditions." Outside the conference room windows, Jessica could see Flight 623 being inspected by maintenance crews. Ice was still being removed from the engines, and lightning damage was visible along the aircraft's skin. By any objective measure, the aircraft should have been destroyed by the storm they'd flown through. "I need time to think about it," Jessica said finally. "Of course," General Hayes replied. "But Jessica, consider this. How many other qualified pilots are we losing because we're too focused on psychological perfection instead of operational effectiveness?" As Jessica left the conference room, she carried with her not just the offer of military reinstatement, but the knowledge that her actions tonight would influence how the Air Force evaluated damaged pilots for years to come. 3 hours later, Jessica stood outside the hospital where Captain Martinez was recovering from emergency cardiac surgery. The doctor said he was stable and would make a full recovery. Ashley Chen was sitting in the waiting room, still in her uniform, having refused to leave until she knew her captain was safe. "How is he?" Jessica asked, settling into the chair beside Ashley. "Surgery went well. They cleared the blockage and restored normal blood flow. Doctor says he'll be back to flying in 6 months if he wants to." They sat in comfortable silence for several minutes, two pilots who'd shared an experience that would bond them for life. "Captain Stone," Ashley said finally, "I've been thinking about what happened tonight, about how you stepped forward despite your medical discharge. That took more courage than anything I've ever seen." "Fear is normal, Ashley. What matters is what you do with it. Tonight you kept your head when everything was falling apart. That's the mark of a real pilot." "Will you take the Air Force's offer?" Jessica looked out the hospital window at the snow still falling over Colorado Springs. In the distance, she could see the lights of Peterson Space Force Base, where her military career might have a second chance. "I spent 4 years thinking I was broken. Tonight I learned that maybe being broken doesn't mean being useless. It just means being different." Ashley nodded, understanding. "The passengers on that flight will never forget what you did. Neither will I." As Jessica walked out of the hospital into the early morning light, her phone buzzed with a text message from Richard Thornton, who'd somehow gotten her contact information from the airline. "Captain Stone, I meant what I said about being wrong. My investment firm works with veteran employment programs. If you ever need anything, civilian or military, please call. You taught me that real value isn't measured by what people own, but by what they're willing to do for others. Thank you for saving my life and my perspective." Jessica smiled, pocketing the phone as she walked toward the rental car that would take her back to Tucson. The drive would give her time to think about General Hayes' offer, about whether she was ready to return to the military world that had once discarded her. But regardless of what she decided about her future, Jessica knew that she was no longer the broken pilot who'd been medically discharged 4 years ago. She was someone who'd proven that courage, competence, and character mattered more than perfect health or prestigious appearance. The woman who'd been dismissed as nobody had become somebody who mattered, not because she'd won recognition or awards, but because she'd stepped forward when others couldn't, used damaged skills to save undamaged lives, and shown that true qualification came from the heart rather than from medical boards. As Jessica drove south toward Arizona through the clearing weather, she carried with her the knowledge that Flight 623 had changed more than just aviation policy. It had changed how she saw herself, how others saw her, and how an entire system might learn to value human potential over human perfection.